Hello, I'm Lee Feinstein, Dean of the School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University in Bloomington. Welcome. In this campaign, the heartland is being depicted as an aggrieved region of the country, the one most affected by the failures of foreign policy and trade policy. But there's a long tradition in the Midwest of support for US engagement in the world, and for a particularly pragmatic style of US leadership. In fact, the Midwest has produced some of America's greatest foreign policy thinkers and military leaders, including Douglas MacArthur, who scored a mention in last night's debate. It's a foreign policy tradition embodied by two of our nation's foremost foreign policy leaders, two Hoosiers, who I'm honored to say are on our faculty at SGIS, Senator Richard Lugar and Representative Lee Hamilton. They embody bedrock Midwestern principles that have made this country and its foreign policy better, more pragmatic, and better understood and supported by the American people. Now, those principles are not ones you heard about much in last night's debate. And as someone who has had a hand in preparing candidates for the presidential debate stage in past years, I know a little bit about the difficulty of condensing complex policy issues into the kind of punchy answers that work well on television and still appeal to our better angels. These include principles like the one that the United States is stronger and more prosperous when it's actively engaged in the world, that working across partisan divides produces results, that however strong or prosperous we are, we can't do everything on our own, that trade deals can be good or bad, but that trade is better when there is more of it, and that trade deals, like all international agreements we make, need to benefit people here at home. One thing that was clear from last night's debate, here's a discussion going on about America's role in the world. Has the world become so dangerous that we have to wall ourselves off more than we have done historically? Who are America's adversaries, and who are our allies? The debate raised these and other questions, but didn't resolve them. And that's why we're here tonight, to provide some further elaboration and to examine what's at stake in various courses open to us because of the choices we're about to make in November. Whether it's the dangers of Zika, the role of the United Nations, the worldwide issue of refugees, an issue which has touched us here in Bloomington, and of course trade, which cuts both ways here in Indiana and came up last night. The closing of the Carrier plant and the loss of 1,400 jobs, that was mentioned, but not said was that Indiana exported a record last year of $47 billion in goods and services, and that the top three markets were Canada, Mexico, and China. To provide context, I'm proud to be joined by my fellow faculty members at SGIS, and to introduce them is Joe Wren, anchor of WTIU's Indiana News Desk.
Thank you very much, Dean Feinstein. I am Joe Wren from WFIU News, and our discussion for this next hour will focus on aspects of foreign policy issues that the next president will inherit. I'm joined today by four panelists: David Bosco, Associate Professor of International Studies and an expert on international law and the politics surrounding international organizations; Sarah Bowerly-Dansman, Assistant Professor of International Relations and a researcher of global economic conditions; Yen Long, Assistant Professor of International Studies who studies global health; and Elizabeth Dunn, Associate Professor of International Studies at SGIS and in the IU Department of Geography, an expert on the refugee crisis and displaced persons. Thank you for being here today. And we have audience members with us here in the SGIS building on IU's campus who can submit questions for our panel. But if you're listening online or on the radio, we'd love to hear from you too. You can submit your questions or comments on Twitter at WFIU News or on our website. We have a chat going on there, wfiunews.org. And you can also email us at news at indianapublicmedia.org. Just as a heads up, we likely won't be getting to certain topics tonight like international security and terrorism, since those will be the focus of a panel discussion next week. So here we go. Before we get to the coming election, though, let's talk for a minute about President Obama. The president gave a speech just last week about the United Nations, and he talked about globalism. And David, I was wondering if you can get us started briefly by describing what globalism is, and then what you thought about the president's messaging.
Yeah, I mean, globalism is tough to define, but I think it's basically the idea that there are and there need to be strong connections between different countries, different societies, and those connections can be through migration, through trade, through cooperation on public health issues, and a belief that international organizations like the UN, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, that all of these things are helpful. They may need to be modified and reformed from time to time, but they're basically helpful as mechanisms for fostering cooperation. And I think that's the view that President Obama represents. And I think one of the striking things about his speech to the UN, which was his final speech to the UN as president, was he kind of acknowledged that both in the United States but also in other countries, you're seeing a reaction against globalism. And it comes in a variety of different forms and it takes different flavors. But he kind of acknowledged that, and he said we can't let this push globalism back because we need to make more connections. We can't retreat behind walls. But he did say we may need to do what he called a course correction, that we may need to work to make sure that the institutions and methods of cooperation that we have are benefiting everyone and are seen as legitimate. So I think there was some acknowledgement by the president about some of these themes that seem to be so resonant during the election campaign here.
So as we kind of look ahead now to the election, what kind of approach do you think that we should expect from Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump to take in regards to globalism?
Yeah, well, I think, Hillary Clinton, I think, represents in large part, and I think she's partly doing this intentionally as a kind of continuation, broadly speaking, of the Obama policy and of engagement with the world. And she certainly wants to present herself as the candidate who represents engagement with the world more than Trump does. Now, she's emphasized that to more and less degrees in different areas. On security, I think she's definitely taking that approach. But on trade, it's been interesting, and this got discussed last night. She's kind of she's been skeptical now of TPP, something that she supported as Secretary of State. And so there's not really in this election right now a strong voice for international trade. I think, Clinton has backed off of that. And the Republicans, who would traditionally be the pro-free trade party, are in a very different place with Donald Trump.
And then how about, I was going to ask more about Donald Trump and his take on this.
Yeah, well, his take is quite clearly that international trade deals are a ripoff for the United States. I mean, he said NAFTA is one of the worst deals ever. He's clearly against TPP, even more vitriolic about that than Clinton is. And I think he's talked about backing out of the World Trade Organization. I mean, he views these things as ripoffs for the United States. The United States is giving much more than it's getting. And that's his view internationally about a whole variety of institutions, not just in the trade area, but in security, alliances, NATO, those kinds of things. He thinks these things are bad deals for the United States. So I think I would expect that he'll continue to hit those themes as he moves forward.
Sarah, would you like to chime in there?
Yeah, where to begin? Well, I think that what you're seeing right now in this election is that on both sides, both the Republicans and the Democrats, there's been a lot of pushback against globalization. And if you look at what over the past 40 years has happened to wages, you can see that overall, globally, wages are going up and inequality is going down globally. But within especially developed countries like the US and much of Europe, you're seeing a kind of hollowed out middle class. And so I think one of the things that's really important when we think about how America engages in the world and the important and presidential policies towards trade and other matters in the global sphere is that ultimately presidents need domestic support. And what we're seeing right now is a lot of domestic reasons why it's hard even for candidates such as Hillary Clinton, who historically has been in favor of deals like NAFTA, deals like TPP, trade in general, institutions as important component of global governance, why we see that it's hard for her to take on that mantle in this particular election. But if you look at what's happening with kind of this changing economy that the US as well as in Indiana we see, a lot of the changes to our economy, the decline of manufacturing is kind of producing a lot of jobs, is really, it seems like it's being driven by globalization, but it's actually much more about things like technological innovation that replaces workers with robots. And so these would be challenges that we would be facing even without deals like NAFTA and deals with TPP. If you look at the kind of proportion of jobs in the US that are coming from the manufacturing sector over time from the 1940s until today, you see a steady decline. And what you don't see there is any major kind of shift in the rate of that decline after NAFTA, after 2001, right? And so what you're seeing is we're shifting into an information economy. Oftentimes, a lot of the kind of struggling middle class are placing that blame on globalization when this is really about kind of much larger forces at work. And the next president is going to need to do more to bring the domestic politics more in line with kind of understanding sort of where we are in our economy and also doing more to help those that are displaced by those changes to our economy.
When you mention larger forces, are we talking about agencies, the UN, NATO, and what are feelings about them right now in this election process? And maybe David, you want to jump in on this as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think Sarah's probably talking about larger economic, technological forces. I think, the UN and NATO are good examples of kind of core international organizations that have long been have long been pillars, I would say, of U.S. foreign policy, particularly NATO. The U.S. has had a more fractious relationship with the UN over the years, but particularly NATO has been an institution that's kind of a bedrock in terms of U.S. foreign policy. And one of the startling things about the election for foreign policy experts is to see Trump essentially saying not only that our European partners aren't paying enough for defense, which is something that every U.S. defense secretary has said for the last several decades, but that the implication of that is we might not be there for you, if it comes down to it. And that's new, and that's very unsettling. It's certainly unsettling for a lot of U.S. allies, and I think that was a point where Clinton last night really tried to hammer that home and say, no matter what this guy says, we are going to be there for our treaty allies.
It's very interesting. I was thinking after watching the debate last night how in the 90s you get an extended discussion about soft power and how do you use your influence on the world stage to encourage lots of actors to go along with you because they believe in the same things as you, right? That you have shared values and purpose. And then we shifted towards thinking about smart power because of kind of concerns of overreach in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, and trying to be more careful, thinking about how the U.S. needed to engage where necessary, but kind of do things a little bit more on the cheap. And now we're talking about let's just kind of forget about fostering cooperation and move into this very transactional, in every negotiation, I'm willing to walk away, blow things up, in order to get the best deal that I can at this given moment. And we're just not in a place in the world right now where that makes any sense. 20% of jobs in Indiana are dependent on trade, either because those jobs are producing things for exports or because those jobs, people are making things in those jobs that require imports in order to, as components for them to create these jobs, or these products. So, in that sort of environment when we're already so interconnected, it's really hard to kind of imagine what it would look like for us to disentangle ourselves from this globalized world that has been created over time.
One international topic with most direct ties to Indiana right now would be the refugee crisis in the Middle East. And our state currently fighting a court ruling that says Governor Mike Pence cannot prevent federal grant money from helping Syrian refugees. And Elizabeth, you've done a lot of work with refugees. The argument from Governor Pence, though, is about security. So about keeping Hoosiers safe from foreign-born terrorists. Is there any truth to that in your dealing?
No, there's really no realistic risk. The Cato Institute, which is a fairly far-right think tank, recently calculated the odds of being involved in a refugee-led attack as 1 in 3.42 billion. So you're 11 times more likely to be crushed to death by falling furniture. So I think that in terms of refugees posing a security risk, they in fact don't pose much of a risk. They're extremely highly vetted, more than any other visitors to the United States. They're first checked out through multiple interviews by the United Nations. I think it's 4 or 5 interviews plus biometric data, which is run against databases. Then that process starts again once they're referred to Homeland Security. So we know more about them than we know probably about our own next door neighbors. I think that they don't pose any realistic risk. But I think that was not what Mike Pence was trying to get at when he said that they were a risk. He's trying to tap into a zeitgeist which says that things that are foreign and strange to us pose a threat to us. And that notion is appearing over and over in lots of different venues. It's a kind of cultural isolationist moment. And it's no accident that this whole conversation about bringing refugees to Indiana happened during an election year.
What about international groups reacting to the crisis? What's that like?
That has been a really mixed bag. I mean, one of the things that we have discovered in the last couple of years is that the institutions that were developed after World War II across a whole variety of domains to regulate trade, to regulate military affairs, those institutions no longer fit very well with the world that we're living in. And so all of these institutions are experiencing major, major change. And that is nowhere truer than in the humanitarian aid system for refugees, which has seen itself be completely overwhelmed in terms of volume. We're now at 65 million displaced people around the world, which is bigger than the population of France. And so they're overwhelmed in terms of volume, but the whole system that was created to manage displaced people, which is based on refugee camps, is no longer functioning. And the organizations that have come together to try and support displaced people temporarily until they can return don't have the capacity to deal with the fact that most of those people will not return. The average length of stay in a camp now is 17 years. The average length of displacement is over 22 years. So this is a permanent condition for a lot of people, and our international migration system is not set up to deal with that.
What? You say it's not working. Why is it not working? What happened?
Well, one of the reasons is that people get stuck in camps so long. You know, camps by their very nature are meant to be temporary. That's why we give people tents and we don't build infrastructure in them. But that's a very difficult place for large numbers of people to live in for decades at a time. We now have camps like Dadaab camp in Kenya that is over 500,000 people and has been there for 25 years. So that's not a camp anymore, that's a city. And the system that we have to move people back, either by repatriating them to their country of origin, that's becoming infeasible because the civil conflicts that have broken out last so long and are so cyclical. The other alternatives are to integrate them in a host country, which is increasingly difficult because of their numbers. 1 in every 4 people in Lebanon is a refugee now. Or to move them to a third country. And most third countries now are not excited about having a large influx of refugees arriving.
I wanted to move over to healthcare now. And Yin, national polling shows the top 4 issues for voters in 2016, economy, terrorism, foreign policy, and healthcare. So what global health issues need to be considered during this election, and are the presidential candidates giving them enough attention?
I think one of the things we really need to think about is among all the high-income countries, the US is the only one without public fund universal health care. And compared to other high-income countries, we spend more money, public money, as well as a private funding on health care. So basically, we are spending more money on health care because of the price tag here is very high, because we rely too much on high technology such as PET scan and so on to resolve our health problems. But the result is we have much worse health outcomes compared to other high-income countries, such as infant mortality rate, such as life expectancy at birth. So those are the things is we really need to look at our neighbors. That's one thing about globalism is we need to learn from other countries. Trump always talk about we're going to make our country great again. But then there are flaws in our system that we really need to take a very hard look at and think about what we can learn from other countries. And another thing is beyond the ideology, division, actually both Republican and Democrat has really left us with, a great heritage in terms of the US leadership in global health governance. For example, HIV/AIDS, it was spreading in the world, but back in 2002, it was the Bush administration, okay, that's contrary to the previous Republican, president. He was the one who committed $15 billion to fund the President Emergency Fund for AIDS relief. And that was the start of global AIDS governance throughout the world. And now we have spent about $65 billion overseas to help other people. But this is not out of moral, ethnic sort of concern. This is really to help to create a safer, healthier environment for our economic development as well as people here, as well as overseas. So those are the things as Elizabeth just talked about, we are facing this conflict, filled world. What are we going to do? It's not going to stop just because we close up our door. We have to step up and take the leadership and take a more of, the stance to tackle those questions, because we are in a position to do such a thing to create a better environment for us.
So how can new leadership in this presidential race, how can that change America's role?
So for example, I think last night, both candidates talked about the approach overseas, and Trump was talking about we are doing all the things for other people, why don't they pay us? But the problem is, this is not the kind of things we're doing for other people. For example, we can just take HIV/AIDS as an example, because that's really one of the greatest achievements in global health history. The thing is, even though at the beginning the US took a huge leadership in terms of funding contribution, but since 2009, middle and lower income countries have already stepped up. Okay, almost 70% of those countries have drastically improved their investment in HIV/AIDS intervention. So that's exactly what Sarah was talking about. We are not just exporting money, we're exporting our agenda, our mission. We're seriously creating a better world now. So now domestic funding resource has become, the primary source for HIV/AIDS intervention in middle and the lower income countries. So we took leadership at the beginning, but then you can see how the world really followed. So that's a kind of American tradition we should, continue.
I want to follow up really quick about pharmaceutical companies, that there's a certain amount of power that comes along with throwing financial support behind those companies. What effect does the international politics have on the drug industry?
In fact, if we look at the top 20 pharmaceutical companies in the world, the US actually took more than half of those spots. which really speaks to the fact that this country is very dominant in pharmaceutical company sort of industry. Okay, when we think about 2001, the whole industry at the global level was only 300 billion. Now we're talking about 1 trillion. And the US is taking a leading role. But then the interesting fact is about TTP is really that trade helps American pharmaceutical companies in terms of extending their patent. And that's not a great thing for global health, I would say. But for those companies, yes, it's going to help them to really conquer the world, especially the Asian market. So those are kind of trade policies, at least in public health areas, really helps pharmaceutical companies. But does it really help people? Let's say American people or people overseas, that's a different question.
I want to remind everyone listening that on WFIU, this is a special from the newsroom and the School of Global and International Affairs about global issues facing the next president. You can tweet us at WTIU or WFIU News, or you can email us at news@indianapublicmedia.org. And don't forget, those of you here in the auditorium, there's some cards I think you can hand out to people in the back of the room, and they'll take them to our panel in the back, and Chuck there will be happy to take your questions as well. This is a question for anyone who'd kind of like to jump in. A portion of the Republican candidate Donald Trump's platform has been argued, advertises the idea of further isolated the United States from the international community, perhaps about that promise of a wall. And some have connected this with isolationist sentiments that may have led to the United Kingdom to withdraw from the European Union in June. Is there a global trend toward this way of thinking?
Yeah, there's a huge spread of kind of isolationism and right-wing populism all across Europe, and Donald Trump is sort of our version of that. But one of the things I find really interesting about Trump is that he puts his finger on a problem that is a real problem. Donald Trump has a point, which is something I never thought I would say. But the point is that many of our attempts to be leaders in the world are not panning out well because the systems that we have to do so are not functioning well. So you look at humanitarian aid, we spend billions of dollars on it, and that amount is increasing dramatically, has over the last 20 years, and yet it's such a complicated system of subcontracting to NGOs and implementing partners that much of the money we spend on aid gets skimmed off before it ever reaches the people that we want to help. That's true in development as well. We spent trillions of dollars trying to exercise soft power in Afghanistan, winning hearts and minds by bringing economic and social development to them. But much of that money and effort was skimmed off by the people who were supposed to implement it because they were operating in an extremely bureaucratized and complex way, and the job just didn't get done. So in that sense, I think Trump puts his finger on a problem, but his solution, which is to withdraw completely and build a wall, is not the right solution to that problem. I work actually on a militarized border in the former Soviet Union between South Ossetia and Georgia. And so I spent my summer looking at what happens when a wall really goes up. And this is one video controlled, patrolled by tanks and so on. And still, smuggling is rampant. And I spent my summer working with smugglers who were moving 20 tons of apples at a time through a supposedly impervious wall. And I think if we were to physically build a wall, what we'd find out is that it doesn't do a very good job of keeping people out. It's a much better idea to look at the ways that we're managing things like migration, healthcare, humanitarian aid, trade, and to think about changing the institutions that we have to manage them rather than just rolling up the sidewalks and going home. Because in the end, that's not going to work anyway.
Yeah, if I could follow up on this, to kind of bring this also into the economic sphere. As I mentioned before, one of the things we've seen with global inequality, and actually we've had global inequality decrease over the past 40 years if we look throughout the world, but within the US and Europe, we see this hollowing out of the middle class. It's pretty well known at this point that as of last month, we haven't had, the middle class kind of average wage hasn't increased in real terms since the 70s. Actually, this past month, we've seen some very promising numbers that might signal a reverse of that trend, but at one point does not a trend make. So we'll see how that plays out. But when you look at Brexit and the decision in the UK to leave the EU, we'll see if that actually ends up happening. There's been a lot of backpedaling on that front. You see a very similar rhetoric about people who feel displaced from trade. And I talked before about how a lot of this displacement is actually because of technological change, but that doesn't negate the fact that there are a lot of people who don't seem to have a place in the global economy or the local economy anymore, and they're hurting. And so I think it's very important to address those particular concerns. There are people who have trained for work that does not exist the way that it used to 40 years ago, and we don't have, we've gone through an extended period of kind of social welfare retrenchment, both in the US and in Europe, which has reduced the types of services available to people who are displaced by these sorts of changes to the economy. And that is, when I say we need to think about kind of domestic support for globalization, that's what I mean. That you need to have more social supports to both help people train into jobs that are available. For instance, we've reduced the amount of manufacturing jobs in the US by, I think, 2 million over the past 10 odd years. But we've gained more than that in terms of jobs in IT. That requires a different set of skills, right? And so I think that's why the rhetoric around trade needs to think a little bit more about how do we create programs for people to retrain them into jobs that are available, and for some people who are too old to be retrained into new jobs, how do we support them through that transition? And if you look at the demographics of who voted for Brexit, right? Older people voted for Brexit, younger people wanted to stay. And I think we see some of that playing out also here in the US with sort of the breakdown of who among which voters Trump's message is resonating with. It's been a little bit different because also we've seen kind of anti-globalization on the left in the US that's been very much driven by students. I think that has a lot to do with the rising cost of college, and that higher education is a necessity in an information economy, and that's another area that we're going to need to do more work on.
I would just agree that, one of the areas where I would differ a little bit with Elizabeth is I think this, and Sarah highlighted this, I think this anti-globalism feeling is not restricted to the right of the political spectrum. What's really interesting is that it kind of connects different parts of the left and the right, and Trump is not a traditional right-wing candidate. He talks about single-payer healthcare, he talks about stuff that's anathema to a lot of traditional Republicans. And it's because he's hitting on some themes that really cross political boundaries. And so it was very interesting in the UK with the vote to leave the European Union that a lot of people pointed a finger of blame not at David Cameron, although there was plenty of blame there, but at Jeremy Corbyn, the leader of the Labour Party, who basically had a very lackluster campaign, ostensibly in support of staying, but really he barely lifted a finger. And that's because on that part of the political left, there's not a lot of enthusiasm for the European Union, and that's for a variety of reasons involving trade and economic globalization. But one of the things I think Trump hits on when it comes to international institutions, and this was very resonant with the Brexit debate, is the feeling that they're kind of out there and they're not accountable and we don't control them and we want to have control closer to home. And I think that's a real issue. I think one of the real fundamental dilemmas of world politics right now is that we clearly need global institutions, but the global institutions we have often have very limited or fragile support in terms of the public, how they go about boosting their own legitimacy, boosting their own credibility when they're not likely to be democratically elected in the way that, that's the way we normally think of an institution getting legitimacy. I think that's a really fundamental issue for our times, and it's something that Trump is getting at in his kind of particular bombastic, I don't read briefing book style, but he's hitting on something that is real.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think one of the things Trump talks about is the problem is nowadays you can't talk about national security, national economic development as if this is a matter of one country or one government. There is no such a thing. If you look at Zika, for example, it took it 50 years to travel from Africa to Asia. But how long did it take to travel from Brazil to the US? Less than a year. So this is the kind of, the situation we're facing is we're going to talk about the security issue because we need unification with shared responsibility. That can generate a better outcome. I think Trump has some good point. Okay, we cannot just take on all this responsibility. However, we can't just withdraw from all the international institutions because we can benefit from other countries as well. And it's not necessarily true that all the countries are, withdrawing from globalization. Actually, a lot of emerging economies, such as India and China, are actually stepping up. And for example, the UK government actually increased, after the economic crisis, increased their investment in global health programs overseas. So it's not just, global trend, but it's another way to think about is how we really figure out our roles or positions in international institutions.
We've heard a lot about human rights and in the U.S., and David, I thought I'd direct this toward you. What about international human rights, and how are those being addressed by the candidates?
Not very much, I wouldn't say. I don't think an international human rights treaty is not something you normally highlight during a debate. I think without having, seen specific statements from the candidates, my guess would be that, Hillary Clinton would be broadly more supportive of engaging in kind of treaty making at the UN and potentially pursuing additional human rights treaties. But it is interesting, one area that I focus on is the International Criminal Court, which was a big treaty in the late 1990s, actually under Bill Clinton, that was drafted. And neither candidate, I think it is safe to say, would have the United States join the International Criminal Court. There are about 125 countries that have joined. From what we've heard from Hillary Clinton, I don't think she would move in that direction. Donald Trump certainly would not move in that direction. And so I don't sense that this is going to be a big issue in the campaign. But I think based on what we know about the candidates, probably Clinton would be more favorable to participating in that kind of activity. The Obama administration departed from the Bush administration in that instead of rejecting the UN Human Rights Council as flawed, which it certainly is, they decided to join. So the US got elected to the Human Rights Council. It's still flawed, but I think it's probably less flawed than it was before the United States joined and used its diplomatic influence there. That's something I would expect Hillary Clinton to follow on. I don't know what Trump's approach would be there, but probably not that.
It's worth thinking about human rights, too, in a more specific sense, rather than sort of thinking about the rights that accrue to all people by virtue of being human. Hillary Clinton famously said that women's rights are human rights. And she's actually been very activist on the international stage at promoting the rights of women and girls, particularly to things like education. She's also been broadly supportive of the rights of displaced people. And last week in New York, the New York agreement was signed, which brought forth some, at least not specific, but broad agreement on principles of human rights for people who are not under the protection of a nation state. So I would see that Hillary Clinton would pursue the issue of rights by pursuing it for particular groups that have been shut out, rather than making sort of broad pronouncements about human rights in general.
But she would still have to get any human rights treaty through the Senate, which is almost impossible these days. So I think it would become for her a question of is it worth the time you invest in these kind of negotiations when it seems like it's so hard to get treaties through the Senate.
I think it's particularly interesting and sad that the discussion around Syria and kind of US response in Syria is almost entirely focused on the security concerns that ISIS might create for the US instead of thinking about refugees and the terrible devastation that is happening there. That is not a discussion that has really been taken up in the campaign so far. And I keep going back to thinking about, the 90s and thinking about the rhetoric around Rwanda, right? And that's where we get this, this springing forth of the idea of responsibility to protect. And that seems to be something that that especially after Iraq and Afghanistan and how terribly that went for many reasons, there's just not a lot of focus, although I would say that Hillary Clinton, in her role of Secretary of State, really did push more for her idea of kind of protecting Syrians from a human rights perspective, was to do more in Syria early on. We can have a whole debate about whether or not that would be a good idea or not, and I think that might be something that's taken up next week in the kind of security side of things. But that's another way to sort of think about this issue is how do we protect how do we protect people in Syria and other places where there is just devastating war?
That's one of the interesting things that Trump has been able to set the agenda in a particular way, which is to have the whole conversation around politics be very utilitarian. What's good for us is good. But in fact, that has not been the response traditionally either by Democratic politicians or Republican ones. We have for centuries thought that we had a role for moral leadership in the world, and that advancing a particular set of values, which included human rights and democracy, greater equality among peoples, has been part of our role in the world. And that, although it has it's been problematic sometimes, George Bush's democratization campaigns were extremely problematic, I think that we have to go back to thinking about the American role in the world as one fundamentally premised on our moral values.
But I think Trump, what I think he's really, another thing that he's tapping on is when people hear people say things like that, particularly in regards to security affairs, they think Iraq, Afghanistan, and they think Libya too. Mm-hmm. Another intervention where we were going to promote American values, and what did we get out of it? We got, a state in total collapse that's creating, chaos in the region. We got weapons flowing everywhere. And so I think at this moment in history, trying to argue for international engagement, that we have some kind of moral duty to do this, particularly when it comes to intervention, becomes very, very problematic. Now, of course, that's not the entirety of engagement, I think.
Well, we substituted military intervention for a whole range of other mechanisms for intervening in crises around the world. Yeah. And I think Sarah's right when she says, dealing with displaced people, there are 7 million Syrians inside Syria who are displaced, in addition to 5 million refugees outside Syria. That's a security issue, and you can't just park them in Greece and pretend that that security issue has gone away. But it's also very much a moral issue for us, and it's a way of intervening in the world by trying to resettle refugees, by trying to care for people who are poor or disabled, that we can intervene in a way that's extremely positive, which is not militaristic. So I don't believe that the military is the only or the best way to intervene. And I think that we substituted that mechanism for a whole variety of other ways of acting for too many years.
I want to go ahead and just, if you're joining us, this is a special from the WFIU newsroom and the School of Global and International Studies about issues facing the next president. We want to go to a couple questions now that we have. This is a question from the audience. What do you think is currently the greatest threat to the global economy and the American economy, and what steps can we take to address it?
That's going to me?
Whoever wants to jump at it.
You're better equipped than I am.
Do you really want me to start with that? What is what's the biggest threat?
The biggest threat, yeah.
Well, gosh, which to pick? I think for me, of course, Obama has really emphasized that in the long run, environmental issues are really the biggest threat to global security. I think that that is really important to kind of to remember. But the thing that I think about a lot is what happens if China has a gigantic debt crisis, which very well may happen.
China does.
And I think, we've stopped kind of prognosticating on when the communist regime is going to fall in China. That became a game for quite some time, that people just sort of decided, oh, the Communist Party has it together. That's not going to happen anytime soon. Let's stop talking about that. But China is very over-leveraged, has a growth model that's basically catch-up growth. So it's a lot easier to grow when you're starting from a pretty low base, right? Plus, a lot of overcapacity. The state has borrowed so much, both and especially at the kind of local levels. And so what happens when there's a big debt crisis? What happens when growth slows enough that, people really start, that you can't create enough jobs to tamp down kind of protests? The amount of debt that U.S. debt that China owns, plus the kind of role of China as the second largest economy in the world, and uncertainty over what happens to the state, is really what I think of as being a particularly fraught problem. And I think that's one of the reasons why, Obama really wanted to, as he was trying so hard to pivot to Asia, and that's one of the reasons why he wants to create, TPP. We'll see if that actually ends up getting ratified.
Can I note one more really bizarre thing about this election? Is that, again, the traditional setup has been that kind of, the Republicans are more hawkish, and they have a long history of hawkishness, particularly vis-a-vis the Soviet Union, now Russia. And in this election, you've got, Hillary Clinton as much more hawkish and skeptical of a country like Russia than Donald Trump is. And it's a bizarre kind of political alignment. But it goes back to kind of, well, what is Trump's vision if it's not, international organizations and the liberal world order? What is it? And, there was a very smart article written by a guy named Thomas Wright at the Brookings Institution, and he basically said Trump has a 19th century foreign policy, which is about spheres of influence between great powers. And so, what might happen in a Trump administration is, well, U.S. and China cut a deal so that we don't worry about the South China Sea, but they give us better terms in economics or something like that. I mean, that seems to be the way Trump sees the world, is more in those kind of spheres of influence by great powers than it is institutions and laws and norms and all the stuff that a lot of us focus on.
All right, we have another question from the audience. In the coming years, do you think the United States will continue to ambitiously promote democracy and capitalism upon other countries, or will it back off and try to collaborate more with nations of different government systems?
Oh, I think that's already happened. That form of collaboration is already happening, and our willingness to engage with governments that are not towing any particular line about democratization has been there all the time. The attempt to reset relations with Russia, it did not pan out well, but that was certainly an attempt to acknowledge that we were willing to work with Putin, even though he was an authoritarian. We've been willing to engage with European countries who are veering away from democracy, and we've been engaging with countries like Iran, which are not even making a pretense at democratization. So I think we are increasingly willing to deal with countries who operate under very different principles than our own.
I'd also add to that, the experience especially of the Arab Spring really reinforced kind of the dirty secret of U.S. foreign policy, that we were very willing to work with dictators if we felt like they were the best option for us in particularly fraught areas of the world. And I think that there is kind of what you might call like a realist or pragmatic turn in some of the ways that we think about engagement with other leaders, as well as, again, kind of going back to the rise of China and this idea that countries can reach a level of development and get onto the global stage when they're not democracies, and so therefore we need to engage with them. But I do think that the US will continue to find ways to try to promote democracy, maybe more of a long game, especially since we've recognized that kind of regime change assisted by a military occupation is not particularly a great way to get democracy, but I think sort of perhaps more investments in trying to help civil society develop in in countries is going to be sort of where we place our kind of focus.
Except that we've shown ourselves to be really not very good at supporting the growth of civil society abroad. And despite spending many millions of dollars at it, we haven't seen that any of our kind of at least formal efforts at encouraging civil society have panned out well at all. So I have a certain skepticism, not about what we mean to do, but about what we can do. And I think sometimes we're not as capable of affecting change as we think we might be.
I completely agree with that assessment, but I do think that we will try.
I might have to disagree. First of all, promoting democracy and promoting capitalism are two very different things. And if you look at the TTP, I think actually the development along both lines are happening. On the one hand, we can see some conservative move in terms of pharmaceutical companies. But on the other hand, when you look at tobacco control, actually TTP has made great progress exactly because of a civil society, sort of civil groups' efforts, not just in the US, but also overseas. So I think on the one hand, we are probably going to stick to the bilateral, sort of that kind of traditional approach. However, I do think the US is changing its approach in terms of multinational or multilateral engagement. And one of the things about China is, even though it is a socialist regime, however, the great thing about it is it always follows the rule of international order. It doesn't really play its own game. It tries to figure out how this game is played, and it tries to find out what, how to, best play it to its interest. So it's leaving this whole international order and promoting something totally different. It's probably not going to work.
Let's go to another question from the audience. Given the extreme opinions in the presidential election, how do you see Congress moving on global economics, as some Republicans might try and distance themselves from Trump to get support from some more moderate constituencies? David, Sarah, I'm going to jump in on that for a little bit, and we're kind of running out of time. So,
yeah, this is a time in which there seems like there is no place there's no one to be the person that puts forward, trade liberalism on the agenda. So, maybe in a lame duck session of Congress, but it seems like for a little while we're kind of in retrenchment mode there.
Yeah, a lot of it depends on what happens in the congressional elections, but if there is a voice for kind of traditional pro-trade sentiment, it would be Republicans in Congress. Somebody like Paul Ryan, or they still support this kind of thing, broadly speaking. But they're tugged in different ways by their electorates, and one of the problems of the kind of gerrymandering and the increased polarization of Congress is that that kind of moderate, centrist, pragmatic view has a harder time being heard, I think, across the board, and certainly on international trade.
And one other thing I'll put in here, though, is that this is sort of what you get when you do a lot of trade liberalization, but you don't really think about helping people adjust, right? So this is also a product of kind of their own making in many ways.
Let's try and get one more question in here from the audience. Have the two parties switched on their traditional roles as hawks and doves in foreign policy, and what are the implications for the presidency as an institution?
Well, I think that was your argument, wasn't it, David, in many ways that they have flipped. But I don't think that it's necessarily that one party is hawkish and the other is dovish. I think that what has happened is a definite disparity in their willingness to engage beyond our borders. But most of the Republicans, including during the primaries, all of the candidates during the primaries, when pushed to say, what would you do if you had to engage abroad, would say that they would engage militarily and that they would do so with what they saw as overwhelming force, right? Gonna bomb the sand into glass. So those are not the words of a dove. So I think the question is how willing they are to go abroad, and then you can talk about how willing they are to go to a military option to act abroad. It's two different questions.
I agree with that entirely, that the major issue here is about how much do we want to engage with the world rather than are we going to be peaceful or warmongering. But I would also say that this election is so weird that I think that it remains to be seen how things shake out in terms of kind of party alignments afterwards. And I think that's the real kind of question in the room is what is the Republican Party going to look like in December?
This has been a weird election too because it's I think one of the first elections where a major party has come out and said that knowing things about other countries and understanding them in order to have good foreign policy doesn't matter. And I would say the one thing that we're very agreed on here at SGIS is that knowing a lot about other parts of the world, whether or not we choose to engage there, leads us to make better policy. So the kind of revival of know-nothingism, I think, is detrimental to our politics as a whole.
David, any last comments or
just to tag on to that? I mean, there was I think a point in last night's debate when Clinton said, "Look, here's a letter signed by 50 foreign policy experts about how dangerous Trump would be," and Trump's response was, "Look where these foreign policy experts have gotten us over the last decade or so," and it's it's a silly response in some respects, but it's I think just to tap onto what Elizabeth was saying, I mean, there is this skepticism of experts, and Trump is really trying to hit on that theme that, look, Clinton's surrounded by experts, she's the establishment, she's got experts, everywhere, but what have the experts done, and if you don't like what they've done, then I'm your man, seems to be his theme.
Okay, we're going to try to fit in one more quick question, and Sarah, maybe you can jump on this really quick. How can we continue to become a more global economy while at the same time developing more localized food production systems and promoting more sustainable trade?
Well, I'm not an expert in food, so I'm going to have to punt a little bit on that one. But I will say that, again, I hate to keep harping on this, but kind of finding supports for people who are displaced by trade is really important. As we go through this change in technology, we may need to look for things like a universal basic income, where maybe not everyone will, maybe we might not be able to support, full-time work for as many people as we did before. And if that's the case, we need to find ways to allow people to have to be able to support themselves in some way.
We got about 30 seconds.
The issue about the Farm Bill the issue about local food production has everything to do with the Farm Bill. And we don't subsidize the production of fruits and vegetables. We subsidize the production of grains, and we try and compete with subsidized grains on the international market. So the answer is, if you want local food production, don't try and combat imports, support local production through the Farm Bill.
And on that note, we have to go.
That's a good
Thank
way
you
to
very
think about
much.
it.
Thanks to our panel. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.